Now that you're familiar with how variables and constants work, let's talk about the names which we describe our variables with. For both variables and constants, we first start with the keyword and then the name of the variable. If you look at our code, you'll notice that I only use single word names for both our variables and constants. str, though that's not really a word, number, and language. What if I wanted to use two words? Can I do that? Well, certainly, but there are some rules about naming, some of which are enforced by syntax, some of which are conventions that we need to follow if we want to speak and think like a Swift programmer. Let's add another comment to our playground to talk about naming conventions. So we'll specify naming conventions as the section name. Okay, so we have a constant named language here, and we've assigned the string Swift to it. What if I wanted to create another constant called programming language and assign the string Objective-C? Let's try that. We'll say let programming language equal Objective-C. If we try and write it out like that, like we would a normal English sentence as two words, well, that won't work. First, as you can see by the difference in color over here, the compiler, that is again the brains behind Swift, thinks that when we type out language over here, we're referring to this constant that we declared earlier. If we click on the error, it's more evident because the error message says that consecutive statements on a line must be separated by semicolons. This means that the compiler thinks that these are all separate lines or separate statements of code. So we'll add another comment in here and we'll state rule number 1, spaces not allowed when writing out names. Okay, so you notice that I just wrote a comment here. Keep in mind that you can also comment out code by simply adding 2 forward slashes to that line at the start. This way the code is not executed, but we can still see that this is an example that doesn't work. So let's copy this and paste it right here. So now you see rule number 1 and an example that won't work. Or we can do it another way. So what we've seen so far over here, these are just single line comments. You can actually also create comments that span multiple lines in Swift, and there's a different syntax for doing that. So instead of 2 forward slashes, we start with a single forward slash and then an asterisk. Now everything after this is a comment. And then to end it, we put an asterisk, and another slash. Okay, typically it's done like this, and it's indented neatly. There we go. That looks much better. Okay, so we know this didn't work, so let's try joining this word, right? So we'll say let programming language equal Objective-C. Okay, so now there's no error, and we have a constant that has a name longer than one word, but we have a problem. It isn't really readable. The word seems okay here because the L over here makes it a tiny bit obvious when you're quickly reading where the second word starts, but it might not be obvious for everyone. Our second rule is less of a rule because no one enforces it, but more of a convention. The convention is simple. When you have a variable or a constant name that has more than 2 words, the first letter of the first word is lowercase. The first letter of any word after that is uppercase, and they're all joined together with no spaces. Okay, so how do we do that? So over here, it says programming language. So the first letter of the first word is lowercase, and then we need to make the first letter of any word after that uppercase. This naming convention or style is known as camel case. The reason it's called that is because if we have a long name, let's say a variable name something like var iPhone development programming language, these alternating uppercase and lowercase letters form peaks in the word that sort of look like camel humps. There are other conventions in other languages, but here in the world of Swift, we're going to strictly stick to camel case. If you write your code in, say, all lowercase or all uppercase, or even with underscores, it's evident to existing Swift programmers that you're coming from a different domain and you're not familiar with the language's conventions. So stick to this. Okay, let's add another comment in here. So we'll do another multi-line comment. So /**. We'll say rule number 2, use camel case. And to show an example of what doesn't work, we'll say that programming language equal Objective-C. And we'll say that this is wrong. Okay, so let's add another example so that we can get used to it. What if I wanted to say what my favorite programming language was? Well, then we'd write it like this. Let favorite programming language equal Swift. Okay, so this final bit of naming is about what we cannot use. So rather than a rule to follow, these are a list of characters that you cannot use when naming. Constants and variable names cannot start with a number. Now you can place a number anywhere after, but the first character always needs to be a letter. Like we discussed, you also cannot have spaces or white space characters, as they are formally known, and you cannot have any special characters. No exclamation marks, no periods, commas, question marks. None of those will work because, as we will see soon, they are also reserved keywords that are part of the Swift language, like var and let. You cannot use other symbols like mathematical symbols or line and box symbols as well, because again, they have their own meaning. Now, Swift does allow the use of emoji as variable and constant names, but I think that was just the language developers having some fun. So please do not actually use emoji to name your variables. But just to show you that it actually works, in the edit menu, I'll click emoji and symbols, and now you can select something like this, and you can say var equal cat, and that works. And now if we copy that and paste it again, you'll see it now refers to cat. Hey, look at that. You've made progress in your path to becoming a programmer. High five. I find it a good practice to recap what we've learned in the last videos before we take a short break, so let's do that. First up, we learned about types and syntax. A type is a construct to represent different kinds of data, like letters or numbers. We briefly touched on a new type that you've never heard of before, strings, and we'll look into what strings are more in depth in the next video. Syntax consists of commands, special words, and punctuation that we use to put together a program. The very first bit of syntax we learned was the keyword var. Var allows us to create a variable, which can be thought of as a container for some data that we can change. When declaring a variable, we start with the keyword var, and then we give our variable a name. We then follow it up with an equal sign and then assign some value. The equal sign is also part of the Swift syntax and is known as the assignment operator. The assignment operator takes a value on the right-hand side and assigns it to the variable or constant on the left-hand side. We also learned of the counterpart to variables, constants. Unlike variables, which are mutable or can be changed, constants are immutable, and as the name suggests, they are constant. To create a constant, we follow the same syntax as variables, except we use the keyword let, L-E-T, instead of var. Then we learned about naming. Naming is simple, we just have a rule or two to follow. So no white space, do not start with numbers or any special symbols, and then use camel case when the name contains more than a single word. So no underscores and no all lowercase or uppercase. And that wraps up our first lesson. One of the things students ask most often after learning this is, what should I use and when? Variables or constants? At first glance, it seems like they only have subtle differences, but for the most part, they're simply containers for values. On the contrary, mutability, that is, the concept of data changing out from under you, has extremely important implications in writing code. What you want to do is always, and remember I said always, start with a constant first. If you realize that you need to change the data being held by that container, well then you can simply switch to using a variable. Honestly, this won't matter as much when we're learning the language, but when you write apps, it is important, so it's best to get used to it now. In fact, this is one of those things that Xcode loosely enforces. When you write code, if you use var but don't end up changing the contents of the variable, Xcode will suggest that you change it to a constant. Alright, I hope that wasn't a lot of material. We're just getting started. Before you head on to the next video to learn about strings, let's take a short and simple quiz to make sure we know what we just learned. Good luck!